Greetings and welcome to the course of urban planning. Today, we are going to develop a conceptual understanding of the urban areas. We will identify its distinctions, look at varied definitions and terminologies involved. To start with, we are first going to explore the differences we experience between urban and rural areas in the Indian context in the section differentiating the urban from the rural areas. This will be an experiential and perception approach which will be adopt to see these distinctions. Thereafter, we'll look at some of the expressions, definitions provided by key authors and institutions in the domain of urban studies in the section Concepts of Cities. Following that, in the section Administrative Definition used by various countries, we will explore various definitions used across the globe by different countries. Thereafter, we are also going to familiarize ourselves with different boundaries recognized in the urban planning domain in the section Geographical Boundaries of Urban Areas and Terminologies. Finally, we will cover the classification of urban areas and the local governing authorities in Indian context in the section Classification of Urban Areas and Local Governing Authorities in India. The learning outcomes targeted in today's lecture are to develop the ability to identify the distinction between the urban and the rural areas, to nurture the potential to deliberate and quote key concepts of cities. We should be able to identify different key authors who have written in these areas and should be able to discuss on the conceptual understanding of cities. Further, we should be able to build the skill, we should be able to synthesize and review various definitions of urban areas at the global and the national level. Further, we target to instill the aptitude to recognize various geographical boundaries of urban areas and label the terminologies. To inculcate the ability to distinguish various urban areas and the governing local authorities. This would be our final outcomes, which we'll be focusing in this particular lecture. Coming to the first segment, where we look at how urban areas are different from the rural areas. In these two pictures, we see the major difference, what we have experienced, all of us either live in the rural area or live in the urban area. The major difference, what we see is that we are less people in the rural area, whereas we see large population in the urban area. So these two pictures show you the contrast between these rural and the urban areas. We further also notice that in the rural areas, we are almost similar kind of people. We are from the same group, cultural orientations, even the educational background. Whereas in the urban areas, we find there is a lot of heterogeneity. We see that people have different occupation, different culture, different religious aspects. So we see a lot of heterogeneity in the urban area. Likewise, we also see that in the urban areas, people use a lot of collective places. They share facility like transportation, the school, colleges, recreational spaces, whereas in the rural areas, these places might be lesser in number and probably less of sharing happens there. Other thing which is very much evident, especially in Indian context, is the nature of the houses. We see that a lot of permanency is seen in the urban areas with the kind of structure we see. And in the rural area, the houses which are there are more of a temporary nature, more of a vernacular, materials are used, so we identify these distinctions as well. Other major difference which we see is the density. Like in the picture on the left hand side, you can see high density, where in a small pocket of land, so many household lives. Whereas on the right hand side, you see a lower density, where lesser people live in a piece of land. So these are very marked distinctions between the urban and the rural areas. Further, we see that there is also administrative difference. We see Gram Panchayat in the rural areas, whereas we see municipal corporation, municipalities in the urban areas. So there's a difference in the urban administration, rural administration in these two areas. Now, moving on to the next segment, where we will look at the concepts of cities. We see that definition given by United Nations, we see that cities are places where large number of people live and work. They are hubs of government, commerce, and transportations. We have seen already in the pictures how there is difference in the population, there is difference in the nature of work they do, and there's also difference in the kind of setup, government setup, and also the transportation and commerce and all these differences, variations we have seen. So United Nations describes cities as these places where these differences are there. Further, we look at the definition given by Gallian and Ashner. They describe the city as the confederation or the union of neighboring clans, resorting to a center used as a common meeting place for worship, protection, and the like. Hence, the political or sovereign body formed by such a community. So we see the important aspect which they highlight here is the confederation, the union of different neighborhood clans. So they all come together to use the common facility and they have one identity. The another description which we see is an urban area can be defined as a composite of cells, neighborhoods or communities where people work together for common good. Here again we see how the composite of cells, every unit coming together becomes an important distinction of identifying the urban areas. Here also we see that how communities come together for a common good. By coming together, they are all benefited by the common aspect is received by them. Other definitions which we see in this similar aspect is urban areas are those locations where there is opportunity for diversified living environment and diverse lifestyles. People live, work, and enjoy themselves in social and cultural relationships provided by proximities in an urban area. Here we see that while defining urban areas, the location aspect comes out. Also the aspect of opportunity for all people, opportunity for diversified living, diversified lifestyles is also highlighted in this definition. Other aspect which we see is people live, work, and enjoy themselves. So the lifestyle aspect is also here. And then we also see in the definition the social and cultural relationship. The heterogeneity which we saw in the pictures also comes here in the definition part. Next definition or description which we see by Gallian and Ashner is the word city implies a concentration of people in a given geographic area who support themselves on a fairly permanent basis from the economic activities of that area. The city can be center of industry, trade, education, government, or involve all these activities. So here again we see the concentration of people, the population aspect, the density aspect come into the picture, the geographical area, the location aspect comes into the picture. The permanent character is also discussed in this, and then the characteristic, the economic characteristics, the other characteristic, industrial, education, and government, that all come together to define the cities. Now we'll look at other definitions, especially given by Louis Mumford in the architectural record. He has described cities as the first one we see. The city is a related collection of primary groups and purposive association. These varied groups support themselves through economic organizations. There are likewise of a more or less corporate or at least publicly regulated character, and they are all housed in permanent structure within a relatively limited area. So here in this definition, we see that again the aspect of collectiveness is highlighted, and also this collectiveness have a purpose behind it. And we also see the other aspect of economic aspect, coming into picture here, and permanency nature also coming into picture while we define cities. Other description which we see by Lewis Mumford is the city in its complete sense is a geographic lexis, an economic organization, an institutional process, a theater of social action, an aesthetic symbol of collective unity. So apart from what we have seen in the previous definition, certain new aspects come here. The geographic lexis, where the integration of all the aspects come. Further, we see the institutional process, plus we see the social aspect, and most important distinction in this particular definition is the aesthetics symbol, the element of beauty which comes here. The other definition which we see in this by Lewis Mumford is one may describe the city in its social aspect, particularly he describes here from the social perspective, as a special framework directed towards the creation of differentiated opportunities for a common life and significant collective drama. So here we see that for the social aspect, they have a goal, they have a collective goal where they are moving towards what they want to achieve in a collective form, and then there is a lot of things which happen in a city. So coming to different layers of the city here. The final definition which we also see here is by Louis Rith. He says that for sociological purpose, a city may be defined as a relatively large, dense, and a permanent settlement of socially heterogeneous individuals. Like we saw in the pictures as well, we see that population, the density, the permanent nature, and then heterogeneity all come together to define the city. Summarizing this, we see that population, density, administrative aspect, economic aspect, character of the city such as organization, shared facilities, opportunities, socio-cultural aspects, the geographical areas, they all constitute or help us in understanding the urban areas. Moving on to the third segment, here we are going to cover the administrative definition used by different countries. We see that government agencies, the researchers, people who study cities, simplify the rural-urban classification based on readily available statistics such as population, size, administrative boundaries, and proportion of adult population in non-agriculture occupation. So these, based on these, usually the countries or the people who study cities classify the urban areas. And key source for all of these information is census reports. Mostly all of the classifications are adopted for the urban areas from the census documents. Let us first look at how India defines urban areas. This classification has been taken from Census of India 2011. The first classification which we see is all the places with municipality, corporation, cantonment board, or notified town, area, committee, they all are identified as urban and they are known as statutory towns. These towns are notified under law by the concerned state or the union territory governments and have local bodies such as municipal corporation, municipalities, municipal committee, irrespective what their demographic characteristic might be. So this is one of the classification which we see in India. There's another classification which we see, the second category of the town is known as the census town, which includes all the other places which satisfy the following criteria. Criteria number one is a minimum population of 5,000 people. We see criteria 2, which is at least 75% of the main working population organized in non-agriculture pursuit. Third component of this second definition, we see density of the population of at least 400 person per square kilometer. So this is how we identify census town in our country. So with reference to this, we are going to look at how different other countries in the part of the world define their urban areas. This was the study done by UN, World Urban Population. The report was published in 2018. In this study, we see that 59 countries use administrative designations as a sole criteria. So we saw, like in India, we use 4 criterias, 2 categories we see. So here we see that 59 countries, they use just first category, the administrative designation as a criteria for identifying the urban areas. So here we see that Poland for here, which you can find out in this place, which is somewhere here. They use towns and cities with Povest status. These are like in this country, they identify, they designate which area would be the urban. Likewise, we see Turkey here. Turkey also does the same. We find it here. And within this also, they use the same administrative designation to identify the urban area. Serbia, we see here, they also do the same thing. So out of these, we are just looking at some of the examples here. We also see Pakistan, which also uses the same administrative designation to identify their urban areas. We also see here Republic of Korea, they also do the same thing. So only one definition they use, whichever is given by the administrative designation. Mauritius here, the small place here, country here, that also uses the same definition. And we also see some St. Helena, which is somewhere here. We also see this, they also have the same criteria. We see St. Kitts and Nevis somewhere here. They also have this administrative designation. So they do not identify by any other aspect, but by the administrative designation. The report also says that 108 countries categorize urban areas by population size or population density. So here we see some of the examples out of these 108 countries. We see Canada, which uses the population size or population density. If I read out the definition, part of the definition here, we see 1,000 inhabitants or more, or at least 400 inhabitants per square kilometer. So those areas are identified as the urban areas. So it's very, to certain extent, similar to the Indian context. The cutoff line, 1,000, here they use 1,000 population, whereas we use 5,000 population. So it all depends on the geographical variation. In Germany, we see here their number is even lesser, 150 inhabitants per square kilometer. So they use density to identify their urban area. China, we see here, they use 2,000 population size to identify the urban areas, and their density value is pretty high, which is 1,500 person per square kilometer. Likewise, we can also see Philippines here. Here we see 1,000 inhabitants per square kilometer, and we also see that their cutoff population is 2,000 inhabitants or more. Taiwan, we see here, is again, we see 300 inhabitants per square kilometer density they specify, and 2,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. And Cambodia, we see here, somewhere located here, we see 200 person per square kilometer, that's the density they specify, and the cutoff population is 2,000 inhabitants or more. So we see that there are countries which use different criteria. Here we see some of the examples which use only population size or population density as an identifying criteria. The study also shows that nearly 37 countries categorize urban areas by demographic characteristic only. So there are no other aspects like what we see in Indian context. They only identify by the demographic characteristics. Some of the examples which I have picked up here are like we can see Mexico, which says 2,500 inhabitants and more, this place. Then we see Portugal, which identifies 2,000 inhabitants or more. So their criteria is just this. Luxembourg, here we see 2,500 inhabitants or more. Saudi Arabia, we see 5,000 inhabitants, which is similar to our Indian scenario. Qatar also has the same 5,000 inhabitants. Then we see Micronesia here, which uses 1,000 inhabitants or more here. The Madagascar, we see 5,000 inhabitants or more. Nigeria, here we see it has a large population, 20,000 inhabitants or more. So something which has this kind of population is only considered as urban. Anything having less than this would not be. Then we see Senegal, which has a cutoff population of 10,000 inhabitants or not. So here we see, that these areas are densely populated. And Libya, we see here 2,000 inhabitants or more. So we see how countries vary in defining their urban areas. And these are the countries which solely define it by the demographic characteristics. Further, we see that, like you have already seen the variations in the numbers, here we see that the population cutoff also varies a lot. We see that it varies from 200 to 50,000 inhabitants, and we identify by 5,000 somewhere. So we see that Iceland, which is somewhere here, it's identifying by the 200 inhabitants or more. Sweden is identifying here again by 200. So these are very sparsely less populated places. So for them, the urban population would be where 200 inhabitants live. Whereas Japan, which has the highest, which is 50,000 inhabitants. So we see Japan here, small place and a lot of people here. So for them, the urban area would be where 50,000 inhabitants live. And likewise, we see American Samoa here, which has 2,500 inhabitants. Bahrain again, here 2,500. Albania, we see 400, and then Algeria, we see again 5,000, and Peru, it's here, which is like 100 dwelling units. So we see a lot of diversity and in how every country identifies their urban place. Looking at the range, here we see that what we saw in the map, we can see here in the graph here, which we see that the range is from 200 to 50,000. Okay, so we are somewhere here between India. So from 200 inhabitants to 50,000 inhabitants, that is how different countries identify their urban areas. Further, the study also shows that 38 countries or areas use economic characteristic as part of the criteria. Here we see that United Republic of Tanzania. Here it identifies I'll just read out this to you, the definition here. Here we see all regional and district headquarters as well as all wards with urban characteristics, that is exceeding certain minimal level of size density criteria and or with many of their inhabitants in non-agriculture occupation. So the economic profile, the nature of job people do also help is criteria placed by some of the countries. We also do that here. We also see Republic of Moldova. This also states that cities and urban types, localities officially designated as such, usually according to the criteria based on number of inhabitants and the predominance of non-agriculture workers and their families. So again, this non-agriculture aspect also becomes a criteria for identifying the urban areas. We also see here Turkmenistan. Here we see, again, when we read this, cities and urban type localities officially designated as such, usually according to the criteria based on number of inhabitants and the predominance of non-agriculture workers and their families. So we see there again, these countries also identify places as urban based on the economic criteria. Likewise, we see Tajikistan, we see Timor-Leste, and Russian Federation also identifies in the similar manner. Next, we see that 69 cases uses functional characteristic of urban areas as part of the criteria. So, here, for example, out of 69 cases, we can see Panama, which uses here we can find the urban characteristics, such as, I'll just read it out, localities with 1500 inhabitants or more with all or most of the following urban characteristics. So, they specify these urban characteristics such as electricity, water supply, sewerage system, paved road, access to commercial establishments, secondary schools, social and recreational centers. So, these characteristics, like if a place has these characteristics, they would be identified as the urban areas. Likewise, we see Oman is another example, which says that with at least 3 of the following basic services: preparatory or secondary school, public electricity network, health center, and telephonic services. We also see here in state of Palestine, here also they identify with the functional characteristics. Here we see public electricity network, public work network, post office, health center with full-time physicians, and school offering a general secondary education certificate. So, we see these characteristics, what kind of functional characteristic urban areas provide. That's how they define the urban areas. Similar is this Slovenia, where we see surplus of workplace, suburban settlements that have fewer inhabitants but are spatially and functionally integrated with the city. Coming to the last part of this, we also see that there are 12 cases in countries where there's no definition. So, we also see that some of the countries do not have any definition or have an unclear definition. So, some of the examples are we see Myanmar, Nauru, which there's no official definition, which we see here as stated by the study. Then we also see that Nauru, we use the entire population as the urban population. Likewise, St. Vincent and Grenadines, then even the Singapore and Saint Martin. So, here all we see that they either do not have definition or have an unclear definition of how the urban areas are defined. So, just to summarize this segment, we see that there is variation in the urban area classification. Okay. So, the variations are based on the administrative definitions, the population variation, the density variation, even the characteristic variations. Characteristic could be the economic aspect or the urban characteristic or the functional aspect. We also see that some of the countries do not have definitions or have very unclear definitions. And the benefit of this variation. So, we do see there's variation, but there are benefits of this variation, so that because of these variations, countries can have definition or have urban areas which align with their culture, demographic profile, and their geographical context. However, there is limitation to global comparison. We are not able to do a global comparison when we do not have unifying definition. So, this was part of our third segment. Now, we will look at the geographical boundaries of urban areas and the involved terminologies. So, here we see that multiple boundary definitions exist for urban areas. And internationally, there is no standardized way criteria for determining the boundaries of the city, and often we see multiple boundaries are given in the city. So, one of the type which we see is the city proper, which is described as a city according to the administrative boundary. So, here we see in this diagram, this is the city proper. In Indian context, we also call it as a municipal boundary. Okay, so this is exactly the administrative boundary where the city works, performs its functions. So, at the international level, they also call it city proper, we call the municipality area. We find another definition, which is urban agglomeration. Here we see this blue line indicating the urban agglomeration. This is the continuous urban area, which is around the main city area, and it falls, it's the peri-urban area around the municipal boundary, which is called as the urban agglomeration. The bigger area compared to that is the called as a metropolitan area, and it is the this boundary is defined according to the degree of economic and social interconnectedness of nearby areas. So, we see that these places are socially and economically integrated to this place, this particular main core area. So, based on that, this metropolitan area is identified. Further, we will look at why this particular aspect is significant. We see that with the example of Toronto, Canada, why it's important for people to study this or look at not just the urban core but the surrounding areas as well. So here we see that with the example of Toronto, Canada, that there is difference in the population size. We see that the city proper has 2.6 million people as per the census 2011. However, the urban agglomeration, the outer area, has 5.1 million people, which is twice as large. So it gives a considerable idea about the city is growing in the outskirts. Further, we see the metropolitan area is further larger, 5.6 million. So by studying all the areas, we really get a complete comprehensive sense of the urban area we are looking at. Further, we see not just the difference in the population size, but we also see the rate of population growth across these three different areas. So here we see, as per the 2006 and 2011 census, city proper, the average growth rate was 0.9%, whereas in the urban agglomeration it was 1.5%. So it is more than this. Further, we see metropolitan area is going further faster than the city proper. So we see that the urbanization process is maybe not just in the urban area but also in the surrounding area. So it's very important that we have understanding of these boundaries, and then we also know how these influence our decision in the main area. So this was about our fourth segment. We'll now summarize this. In this segment, we saw different terminologies, different boundaries for which we look at, and then we also saw why looking at these different boundaries is important. Coming out to the last segment, where we look at classification of urban settlements, and this we look at particularly in the Indian context. We see Census of India follows six-fold classification as per the population size. So, so we identify small town, medium town, large town, metropolitan city and megapolis. Here we see that it also has subcategory. We identify small town 1, small town 2. This is based on the population range. 5,000 to 20,000 is identified as small town 1, and the local authority, which is usually for this size of population, which are almost transforming into the urban area, is Nagar Panchayat. We see small town 2, which is 20,000 to 50,000 in size. Usually they have the local authority as Nagar Panchayat or Municipal Council. We also see medium town. They are further subcategorized into medium town 1 and medium town 2. So we see 50,000 to 1 lakh. Population here, they are classified as medium town 1, and usually they have municipal council. Medium town 2, which is 1 lakh to 5 lakh population, they also have municipal council. We see large city, which is like 5 lakh to 10 lakh population. They have municipal corporation. You must have heard about the terms here. Then we see metropolitan city. We subclassify them as metropolitan city 1, metropolitan city 2. We see 10 lakh to 50 lakh population. The metropolitan city have municipal corporation or metropolitan planning committee. Here, further we see metropolitan city 2, which have, like, these are big cities, 50 lakhs to 1 crore, and number of these are here. Then megapolis, more than 1 crore, very big cities. They are categorized under megapolis, and the local authorities are same as municipal corporation, the metropolitan planning committee. And accordingly, this table also gives, as per the 2011 census, that we have huge number of small and medium town, which is like we have 7,467 cities which are currently small and medium towns. We also see that in the medium, we also have 372 cities. Large city, we have nearly 43 in our country. Metropolitan, we have 45. And we see metropolitan city 2, we have 5 under this category, and we have 3 major megapolis, which are 3 here. So we have seen different classification, subclassification used in Indian context, and the subcategory and number of cities here. So we'll wind up here for this session, and we'll quickly summarize what we have gone through. So we saw the what's the difference between, how do we differentiate between urban and rural areas. We saw different concepts of cities. We also looked at administrative definitions used by various countries, different countries. We saw that. We further saw the geographical boundaries, what all terminologies are used, and finally we saw the classification of the urban areas and local governing authorities in Indian context. So that was for today. These are the references, course books, which we have, from where these content has been made available to you. Our coverage was limited with the scope to make you aware of the topic. There are enormous readings and movies available to explore. Few are suggested here. This is not an extensive list. You may feel free to suggest more from your experience. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about your concerns you have. Do share your opinion, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring cities and urban planning. Thank you.